If not, please pick one up on your way out. Before I introduce tonight's featured Arkansas author, I'd like to recognize some special guests and also some people who helped make this evening possible. We're honored to have with us the Most Reverend Anthony B. Taylor, Bishop of Little Rock. Bishop Taylor, would you please stand and be recognized?
I knew who that
was. We also have with us Brother Patrick Boland, Brother James Lindsay, and Brother Ignatius Petrie of Subiaco Alley. Could I ask the three of you to also stand and be recognized? I'm very appreciative of our sister agency, Historic Arkansas Museum, for their assistance with the logistics of planning this event, and also for allowing us to use this lovely space. If you visited the State Archives, you know we don't have a great programming space, so we're really appreciative that we're able to host the lectures here this year. I'm also grateful to the outreach team at the State Archives for the wonderful work that they did in developing, planning, and promoting this lecture series. I work at a small agency and everybody wears a lot of hats, and they all do so with great aplomb. And I'm very fortunate to go to work every day with this very talented group of people who are passionate about Arkansas history. And there are quite a few people who deserve recognition for making but I do want to recognize one person in particular, Brian Irby. Brian, are you in the room? Yes, Brian. Brian is the person who came up with the idea of the lecture series and planned it and got all the authors on board. He's done a great deal of work to make tonight happen, and I really appreciate this effort. I'd also like to say a very special thanks to the Friends of the Arkansas State Archives for sponsoring the lovely reception. Our Friends group is just a little bit over a year old now, but the support that we've received from them for our events and for advocacy has already made a tremendous difference for us. Last Saturday, just this the Friends Group Board held a quarterly meeting, and they elected a new president, Susan Boyle, who lots of you probably already know from the Prior Birth Records Indexing Project, the Arkansas Prior Birth Records. You may not know that Susan also worked at what was then the Arkansas History Commission for 9 years, 7 years. Susan, where are you? 9 years. So she probably knows more about the Arkansas History Commission than I do and the staff who are here combined. And I've asked her if she would come up tonight and just say a few words about the Friends group. If she would not mind, just a couple of minutes. Thank you. Not to put you on the spot or anything, Susan.
Well, we really are pleased to see all of you here tonight, and we're happy to let you know about the Friends of the Arkansas State Archives. They really need our help and support in order to fulfill their mission of making the state's really precious historic documents and artifacts not only safe but also available to you. We do have some brochures and some membership sign-up sheets out on the table in the atrium, and we would love to have you stop by afterwards and pick one up and join us. We have a very low dues schedule. $10 is the basic dues, or if you want to be a sustaining member, it's $25. And we would love to help you join us. I think the next few years may be very difficult for history and for the archives here in Arkansas. And public support and the actual reaching out to the governor and to legislators is, I think, going to be critical to the survival of the archives and other institutions like the Historic Arkansas Museum. So we would love to have you as members and to help us out and continue to support the archives.
Thank you, Susan. And just an additional word about the Friends Group. For your membership dollars, you do get advance notice of our events and the opportunity to pre-register. So you can get ahead of the general public for our events. We have some great ones coming up this year. I think we have on our website a list of events posted. Mary, is that correct? Yes, we do. So go to our website, www.ark-ides.com, and learn more about what we've got coming up this year. Just one minor housekeeping, a couple of minor housekeeping notes. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, if you have a cell phone, if you could silence it or turn it off at this point, we greatly appreciate it. And I know many of you have questions about whether or not Dr. Barnes' book will be on sale tonight. Unfortunately, no. The gift shop was not able to be open, and that's the only way we're able to sell books at these lectures. So we'll have to get the book and get Dr. Barnes to sign it some other time. But he's at the archives quite often doing research. You might just drop by any day. So as I said, we're delighted to have Dr. Kenneth C. Barnes as the first speaker at this inaugural lecture series. Dr. Barnes is a professor of history at the University of Central Arkansas. He received his BA from UCA and his MA from the University of East Anglia in England and his PhD from Duke University. He taught at Concordia University, Chicago, and the University of Southern Mississippi before returning to UCA as a professor in 1993. He served as chair of the UCA Department of History for 10 years. He's the author of several books and articles on German history and Arkansas history, including Who Killed John Clayton, Political Violence and the Emergence of the New South, published by Duke University Press in 1998, and Journey of Hope, the Back to Africa movement in Arkansas in the late 1800s, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2004. His newest book, and the topic of his lecture tonight, Anti-Catholicism in Arkansas, How Politicians, the Press, the Klan, and Religious Leaders Imagined the Enemy, 1910 to 1960, was published last November by the University of Arkansas Press. Please welcome Dr. Kenneth Barnes.
Thank you. You know, I'm just blown away by the crowd and the interest. You know, when you write a book, you don't really know in advance if people are going to find it interesting. I hope you'll find it more interesting after you hear me talk about it, but I'm delighted to see you here. I want to do a shout out of thanks to the History Commission, to Dr. Spears and to Brian, who did so much work for organizing this, and also for just doing what you do, because anybody who works in Arkansas history uses the History Commission. And that collection of newspapers, I've used it the entire time that I've been working on the subject of Arkansas history. And so thanks for what you do to preserve the history of our state and making those resources available to scholars and to the general public. And I also want to do a shout out of thanks to some old longtime friends that I see in the crowd that live here in the Central Arkansas area or Pulaski County. Nice to see you, familiar faces. Some former students, some of whom work here in professional history capacity here in the Pulaski County area. And then also, again, I'd like to say a shout out of thanks to the bishop and the people here from the diocese and from Subiaco, both of which really contributed more than you probably would know to this project, because I spent time at Subiaco in the archives. I'll show you a picture or two that come from there here in a moment. And then the diocese, Bishop Taylor's office, invested some resources in digitizing the Arkansas Catholic, which in the period that I was reading it, began back in the 19-teens. It was called the Southern Guardian, and then the Guardian, and then in more recent times the Arkansas Catholic. I actually read those, poured over the microfilm in the History Commission till I went blind, one after another. And then I discovered that they were on the internet, had been digitized by the diocese, but it was still very, very useful because I could find all kinds of nifty things by doing a search by name in the digitized version that I missed totally just flipping through it. But then I saw other things doing it that way that I missed with the digitized version. But it's very helpful for me and for those who will follow me in doing research about Catholicism in Arkansas. I also want to thank my wife Debbie for coming tonight because she's heard more than she really needs to know about Anti-Catholicism in Arkansas and read the manuscript, you know, before I sent it off to the publisher. But yet she came out just to be nice tonight. Well, unless you're older than me, you might actually wonder, is there something to talk about with the subject anti-Catholicism in Arkansas? I kind of think that people younger than myself, and I'm 60, might think, well, what's that? Or would that even be a topic? Because it doesn't seem to be, today, a matter of our consciousness. And actually, you kind of have to go back in time to get the sense of how anti-Catholicism would play out very powerfully in Arkansas and actually in the United States. Although some of you might say, in fact I've already heard a really good story, anti-Catholic story, after I got here tonight, that maybe it is pretty relevant to the experience of a good number of you who are here. But this isn't just a weird momentary diversion in history. It actually reflects a theme that's much more central than just anti-Catholicism. And that is this question that you see right here. Who's a real American? That has been a fundamental question in American history since there's been America. Because most people in America came from somewhere else, and constantly there has been this definition of who really is, and then of course in defining who is, people are defining who's not a real American. Back in the earliest days of American history, people from Europe were deciding that if you were Indian, Native American, you weren't a real American. You know, our Constitution, didn't it create a definition of a slave as being 3/5 of a real American? You know, in terms of how that would count for matters of representation. And then we had a whole civil war over that issue of, are people of color real Americans or are they not? And then in Arkansas and many areas of the South, after the answer was yes, you know, from loss of blood on the battlefield, they indeed are, there was redrawing all that question with the whole Jim Crow years up to the modern civil rights movement, where that has been a very important question. Do people of color have the same rights? Are they essentially as American as people of European descent? Well, for a period of time in American history, Catholics, Roman Catholics, were one of those groups that a prevailing dominant element of the population and culture used to define who isn't as real of an American as are they. Really begins to emerge in a very powerful way in the 1800s, in the 1850s, with the Know-Nothing movement. The history folks in the crowd, professional historians and those who were history majors will remember studying about the Know-Nothing Party in the 1850s, a moment when anti-Catholicism became in the face of people and became a political party. And that's shortly following the Irish potato famine and the big Irish migration that came to the U.S. in the 1850s. But then it died down with the distraction of the Civil War in the early 1860s. Came back with a vengeance in the late 1800s, 1880s and 90s, another big wave of anti-Catholicism that was largely reacting to, again, migration, Catholic migration, largely of German Catholics who had come into the United States. And again, many Catholics in Arkansas owe their family history goes back to the part of that migration when many German Catholics came to the United States, and some of them here in Arkansas. But probably the most vicious wave of anti-Catholicism is the one that began in the early 1900s. The 19-teens and the 1920s probably saw the most strident wave of anti-Catholicism, and nowhere was it as vicious as it was here in Arkansas. The 1800s anti-Catholicism was more centered in the north, actually in urban areas in like Boston and Philadelphia and Chicago, places like that. The early 1900s, it was more rural America, the Midwest and the South, and of course, Arkansas fits the bill for that. This wave of anti-Catholicism was reacting to what you see in this slide here. Again, migration, population change. You see the figures there that in 1880, 8% of the U.S. was Roman Catholic, but by 1910, that had grown to 18%. Migration coming from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and continuing to come from Germany and Ireland will account for that. And the second part of that slide would indicate that Arkansans should have not too much to worry about, right? Because Arkansas had one of the lowest percentages of Catholics in all the whole country, only lower above that of Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. But basically the fear in Arkansas was that Arkansas would maybe look like what the United States at large was beginning to look like, as being an urban and largely Catholic country. So that's where some of this is coming from in Arkansas in the early part of the century. Two manifestations of anti-Catholicism in Arkansas in the early teens were a piece of legislation that I'm going to talk about that was initiated by this fellow that you see there, Robert R. Posey from Sheridan. He was actually a UCA graduate, one of the earliest graduates of my alma mater and my institution where I teach. And then on the right side, you see that image there is an image from the masthead of a newspaper that was published beginning in 1912 in Magnolia, Arkansas. It was called The Liberator, and it was a specifically anti-Catholic publication published by a missionary Baptist preacher who was the pastor of First Baptist in Magnolia, but he resigned his position just to devote himself entirely to publishing this and doing lectures against Roman Catholicism. So that's two things. One is this newspaper, a weekly publication that had at its high point about 15,000 subscriptions, mostly in Arkansas and the southwestern United States. And then the legislation that was introduced in the General Assembly about this time, 103 years ago. We're watching what's going to happen this week and next with the General Assembly showing up. I always get a little nervous. I don't know about you guys. When the General Assembly comes to Little Rock. But in 1913, this fellow introduced a bill called the Convent Inspection Bill. And the point of it was to require sheriffs in the counties of Arkansas that had in them a convent, or even like a girls' Catholic school, institution of learning, to go and inspect the convent to make sure that the priests weren't keeping the women, the nuns and schoolgirls, there as sexual slaves. Now, that's shocking, isn't it? I mean, we're almost laughable. I mean, it isn't really laughable. It's not funny, but it's shocking that it would be taken seriously that's likely to be the case. But it was introduced in 1913. It didn't pass, but it's going to come back 2 years later to become law of the land in Arkansas. Robert Posey there in Grant County did not have one Catholic church in the entire county. And actually one of the things that I found in my research is that in the places that had the least Catholics, there you found the most anti-Catholicism. And I could use like how legislators voted on this bill as a yardstick of sentiments on this issue. And I found that the votes against the bill came largely from the Arkansas River Valley, Fort Smith, Little Rock, Pine Bluff, parts of the state where people actually knew Catholics. And the votes against the Convent Inspection Bill came mostly from the parts of Arkansas where there were Catholics were the fewest. You'll notice one thing that made the anti-Catholicism in the teens particularly powerful is what I would call a sort of sexual energy that was associated with the movement. Some of the materials that were anti-Catholic produced by some of the publishers and the lectures that were given against Roman Catholics were almost pornographic in nature. They were titillating at a time in which we're kind of coming out of that Victorian era when people generally wouldn't even use the word sex, like out loud. But yet, there was a preoccupation with sexuality. Sort of, I would make it akin to how around the same time, so late 19th century and early 20th century, when rape accusations were made against black men assaulting a white woman, and of course it was the most likely scenario to be followed by a lynching. That when you add sex to prejudice, it seemed to motivate people in a way that just provided more energy to a movement that was really about prejudice to start with. And you might even notice that image on the right side of the page. This is the only piece of iconography in that anti-Catholic weekly newspaper, and it's depicting the Roman Catholic Church as the whore of Babylon. I actually wanted to call the title of my book Whore of Babylon, but the UA Press thought it was a little bit too off-color, and they nixed that, and what ended up being a better title because it's much more descriptive. But think about what's going on in that picture, and that a missionary Baptist preacher would use an image of the whore of Babylon, and this is from Revelations chapter 17 and 18, where the whore of Babylon is holding in her hand the chalice which holds her fornications, her sex crimes, really, that have been committed, and she's sitting on the back of a seven-horned beast. And if you've studied Freudian psychology, you'll know what a horned beast is connoting, and there are 7 of them there. So there's a lot of sex going on in that image there, again, in a missionary Baptist newspaper. And notice even the chalice that she's raising, holding the cup of her fornications. It looks a lot like a communion chalice, wouldn't you say? Or perhaps it might be a martini glass. It's that hoop-shaped glass, which kind of brings in a whole other issue related to anti-Catholicism in the teens, and that is liquor, alcohol. And of course, actually, it's going to be the same assembly in 1915 that passes the Convent Inspection Act that makes Arkansas a dry state. That same assembly did both. And I think the double imagery that's going on in that icon does speak pretty loudly. Okay, here's an image from one of the most prolific newspapers, anti-Catholic newspapers in the country, called The Menace. The Menace was published in Aurora, Missouri, and that's a little town in southern Missouri, actually about 30 miles. Sorry?
That's my
Hometown, you know, Aurora. Was it 20, 30 miles north of the Arkansas line, something like that?
30 miles from Springfield.
Okay. And the biggest industry in Aurora in the teens was this newspaper. They hired most of the women, young women in that town. The subscriptions of the Menace, which was a single-purpose anti-Catholic newspaper, were 1.5 million at its peak in 1915. This is a time when the New York Times had 250,000 subscriptions. This anti-Catholic paper in this small town, Aurora, Missouri, had 1.5 million subscriptions. They had to have a special train to take off the copies of this, to get them on their way. And it was a prolific paper that it took news from the Liberator and some of the other anti-Catholic magazines and then gave content back. Actually, the Menace staff wrote the language of that convent inspection bill. It's not that Robert Posey and Sheridan had to come up with it on his own. As is the case with a lot of the bills that are probably getting filed this week. Like some lobby group, has got it all written out and they just hand it over to the legislator. Do we have any legislators? What should I say here? But anyway, you get a sense of how the Menace and other anti-Catholic propagandists would play up this sexual fear. And one particular part of that, besides the convent inspection issue, was the assertion that priests used the confessional to pull out of women the most intimate of their sins in great detail and use that as a way to take advantage and establish romantic liaisons and so forth. And you see that being portrayed here. Okay, well this fellow that you see in the long robe had a response to that. Father Boniface Spanka, or Spanky probably people said. Spanka would be the German pronunciation. He was actually born in Germany, but came as a young child to Arkansas and went to Subiaco Academy and then became a priest and lived and died there, years and years later. he was so incensed by that convent inspection bill that he decided to do something about it. He's a remarkable figure. I think he's the most interesting person in my whole book. I'd say there's one on the other side, a missionary Baptist preacher I'll introduce you to in a minute, Ben Bogard, also really, really interesting. But this Father Boniface Spanky was just a real character. And he decided to single-handedly build this, what he called his gospel wagon, and go around central Arkansas to convince these Protestant Arkansans that Catholics don't have horns and tails. They're just people, good people, and to really basically educate people about Roman Catholicism. And he spent the whole summer working on this. I got donations to outfit it. You can see the chairs on the underneath side of that. And inside it, he had a place where he could stay. He could open it up, and it had like a pull-down altar so he could say Mass. I mean, he was really a clever fellow. And he had lots of help from the Knights of Columbus and others in the area in producing this. And he spent basically the entirety of the fall of 1913 pulling this through the muddy roads of Arkansas. And he got stuck many, many times from one place to the next, starting in Logan County, and then to Yell County, and then he went to Polk County, Dardanelle, and Russellville, made his way then east to Morrilton, spoke to 500 people in the auditorium in Morrilton, trying to educate people about Catholicism, and it's pretty interesting that people came out to hear it. 500 was a good crowd, and we have 100 here tonight. 500, you know, would be a big crowd for him in Morrilton. Then he went on to Conway, was speaking at the courthouse, when somebody gave him a flight handbill about some guy who had come to Morrilton after he left to speak against Catholics. In fact, one of the local Protestant pastors in Morrilton invited a speaker, a professional anti-Catholic lecturer, and this is organized by the Menace, that newspaper in Aurora, to come down and give the other side of the story. So Father Spanky abruptly canceled his speech he was going to give in Conway, jumped on the train, went to Morrilton, showed up in the same auditorium he had spoken at, you know, the week before, and sat in the fourth row over and had his hand up, you know, immediately to jump into that conversation. And what he did was he challenged this anti-Catholic lecturer to a full-fledged formal debate on, you know, that basically said everything you're telling people is just falsehoods, and I want to present the other side. Let's have a debate. And they had it. It happened in January. This was end of November. They made elaborate plans for this. And in Morrilton, then in the following January, this is now by 1914, they had really what would have been probably one of the most significant events in the history of anti-Catholicism of this period. To my knowledge, the most widely covered by newspapers and attended by spectators event of its nature of the time. When you see the anti-Catholic lecturer there on the left, his name was Otis Spurgeon. He had come down from Iowa and was, you know, basically traveling the country making money off of prejudice. And then Father Boniface there to the right, you see the headline. This was covered in great detail. Basically every word that was said in this 2-week-long debate was in the Menace. It was my best source. I also use the Arkansas Gazette, and then the Echo, the German language newspaper. There was a Catholic German newspaper published in Little Rock. They also covered the story. So I had plenty of good material. I felt like I was there, you know, because it was almost like every word that was uttered in that debate. For 2 weeks, crowds numbered 3,000 people showed up for this. And this is in a town that has only 400 people in it. So there were like newspapermen from other states. The Menace brought reporters down, other anti-Catholic lecturers. Everybody that was anybody went to Morrilton to listen to this. They actually, the good citizens of Morrilton rented a tent from Kansas City that could accommodate 3,000 people. It was even had, for its time, bathrooms and heaters, because it was January. So imagine, you know, the event that this would be. And for 2 weeks they held forth, bitter back and forth. Several times the jury had to call them out for getting out of hand or getting personal ad hominem attacks and so forth. Until finally, when it was over, Father Spunky had lost 18 pounds. He put that much of himself into this that by the time it was over, he was a much lighter man. And the results were a little mixed. The majority of the jury that attended every night said that those legislators in 1923 were members of the Klan. Well, the Klan rose very quickly. It also died very quickly in Arkansas. In 1925, went down to very small numbers, and it's a much more complicated story than I have time to talk about here. But anti-Catholicism didn't just disappear when it lost this sort of institutional or organizational mechanism for it to operate. The next moment, and this for me is a chapter in the book, when it comes back in a very visible public way, will be in 1928 with the presidential election that year, where we have for the first time in American history one of the two major parties nominating Roman Catholic for the presidency. You know, we've been through a very painful year of presidential politicking, have we not? This was another one of those in terms of just the kind of high and bitter level of the rhetoric that was presented publicly. Really unlike anything that had preceded it in recent times. In 1928, it sort of brought the anti-Catholic positions all out front and center, like you see in these cartoons in 1928 about the election. Al Smith was the governor of New York, who was a child of immigrants, educated in Catholic schools, a member of the Knights of Columbus. So he was everything that anti-Catholics love to hate, really. He represented big, bad New York. New York City, grew up in the city, and a whole other set of values than theirs. And so you can see in some of these images, again, maybe an allusion back to sort of some of that sexual energy, the figure of a young woman representing liberty. Maybe that's kind of Statue of Liberty-esque. They're being ravaged by Roman Catholicism. And then you see a very common statement about if Al Smith is elected, then the Pope's going to be controlling the White House. That kind of stuff that you see on the right. This election was particularly tense and just dynamic in Arkansas because of a local collection. Some of you know where I'm going with this. Who did Al Smith choose as his vice presidential running mate? I thought that many of you would know. Joe T. Robinson, that you see there in the middle. He so nicely balanced out the ticket. To have a Southern senator who's a Methodist, member of one of the large Methodist churches in Little Rock, originally from the Lone Oak area. And a very popular, very successful politician, the Democratic minority speaker, very influential fellow, very good politician, very good campaigner, so perfect. Except, imagine how this played in Arkansas to see, this very popular Democratic politician playing for the other team in that sense of working and cooperating closely with Al Smith. It brought things back again, front and center. The religious press, especially in Arkansas, opposed the Smith-Robinson campaign. The two figures that you see there up on the upper left, Dr. A.C. Miller was the editor of the Arkansas Methodist Weekly magazine. He had formerly been a president of Hendrix College and very much against liquor. He was a pro-prohibition, stronghold person, and particularly opposed the Smith-Robinson ticket because it threatened to end prohibition. And then on the right is the other figure. I think this is probably the most interesting and charismatic personality that's in my book, Dr. Ben Bogard, who was the leading figure in the Missionary Baptist Church. I've mentioned Missionary Baptist already. Baptists tended to be the most anti-Catholic of the various Protestant groups, and of the Baptists, it's the Missionary Baptists that were the most stridently anti-Catholic, and he was the indisputed leader of it. He's actually one of the founders of Missionary Baptist as a denomination, which really took place here in Arkansas. It's a denomination that has its origins here in Arkansas. He had moved to Texas during the teens, so he wasn't around during the Convent Inspection Act and all that, so he kind of dropped out of my radar in the teens, but he moved back to Arkansas and was the pastor of the really large Missionary Baptist Church in Little Rock from 1920 until his retirement in 1947. Dramatic, dynamic, charismatic, intelligent, articulate. I'm just amazed that he could write as much as he did every week. It just rolled off his typewriter. Ripley's Believe It or Not, if you know that, used to be in the old days, a little column in some magazines, featured him as having preached every Sunday without a break for something like 50 years. I can't remember the exact years, but he was featured in there because of his prolific preaching. But he came out against Miller, against Robinson, and against Al Smith with abandon. And of course, in the end, Robinson and Smith lost. And really, it's going to bring a bit of a close of the book to the Anti-Catholicism story. I actually thought I was going to end the book with this election because things really did get better. After 1928, the kind of signature issues sort of resolved themselves. As we move into the 1930s, there were other things, again, to distract people from these issues, like how about the Great Depression, and then we've got World War II on the horizon. And actually by the 1930s you begin to see others to becoming the other than Roman Catholics, like communists began to emerge in the 1930s as the group people love to hate or to portray as the inauthentic Americans. And so anti-communism, I think you could take a lot of the same things that I found with anti-Catholicism and just substitute communist for the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. So I thought that would be the end of the story, but there was a little bit of a comeback in 1960, and some of you can probably remember this. The Kennedy election in 1960, it trotted out the same old stuff, the same old rhetoric that I had studied before. I was a little surprised it was as vicious as it was. Maybe, again, some of you not so, if you remember it well. It's actually one of my earliest historical memories. I was 5 years old when this election took place, and I remember it because my dad had a general store in Conway County out in the country, and it was the polling place for that region, and there was just so much hubbub around the store that I remember it, and I remember being told that if Kennedy wins, the Pope will control the White House. That's my childhood, so I'm telling on myself here, the kind of background that I came out of. I'm kind of surprised that I actually remembered that, or that I even knew who the Pope was when, in 1960 at the age of 5, or what the White House was, but I have a distinct memory of it. But some of the, again, same old stuff, not quite the extent as what happened before, but some of the same people are still around in 1960 who are just coming out saying it again now as old men. Again, this time, the Catholic candidate wins, and really it's going to be one of the reasons why anti-Catholicism will wane in the 1960s. As I continued to kind of chart this, I wrote a chapter about the Kennedy election, and then I have sort of a postscript, an epilogue that carried things forward. And I found in the 60s, things really did change, and Kennedy's election was one of the reasons that people found there really wasn't anything to be afraid of. I mean, he didn't do really anything that Protestants would have to worry about. In fact, some Catholics said he too much drew a line between church and state, some of those issues that were very sensitive. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we have Vatican II, which is going to change the face of Catholicism as it would be seen by others, and make Catholicism seem less foreign or alien than it had been before. That's another factor in the 60s. But then one of the things as we go forward into the 70s that's going to change things even more is that Roman Catholics and evangelicals, those that have been most anti-Catholic, sort of migrate to be on the same team. By the end of the 70s, I could see it pretty visibly coming together and into the 1980s and thereafter to our present day position, so that what we might call the Christian right, if that's a usable term, or family values positions, or all kinds of labels that might be used for religious opposition to gay marriage, to abortion. You could rattle off a number of other issues where we'll find evangelicals and Roman Catholics in general occupying a position of being perhaps allies in some of the political struggles that have taken place. So that I think when we are on this side of this moment, it's hard really to see across it to these moments when Protestants and Catholics, evangelical Protestants and Catholics, were so much at odds with each other. I guess I'd like to maybe end with just a thought. I don't want to make it sound like, oh, things are so wonderful now, no anti-Catholicism, because in fact, I might have actually exaggerated, you know, how much things got better. I got a letter Friday to my office at UCA from a guy who grew up in Arkansas who told some of the most hair-raising tales of being a victim of anti-Catholicism in the 1960s. I'll just give you one example. He said that he went to a Catholic school in Fort Smith, and they had a really great football team. At one point they were one game away from having the longest winning streak in the whole United States, and they were playing against Tulsa, and if they won that game, they would be #1, the longest winning streak of any team in the whole country, but they lost. And at Fort Smith High School, when it came over the intercom that they lost at a football game, it was announced that, I think it was St. Anne's was the name of that school, am I right? That they lost. The crowd stood up and cheered. Can you imagine that in the 1960s? That made me think, well, maybe, you know, I'm exaggerated. How, you know, kumbaya, everybody's happy, things are good, you know, after the 1960s. But I would leave you with the thought, here we are just about to inaugurate a president. Is it over? I mean, are we still othering somebody? I mean, who becomes the new other? If it's not going to be Catholics or people of color or Indians or communists, now that the Cold War's over, I mean, is it still happening? And is it something just to think about as we are in the present and move forward to the future? And I'm trying very hard not to be political this week of all weeks, but it's just a thought I'd like to leave you with, and then I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Dr. Barnes, how did you become interested in this anti-Catholicism?
Well, thank you, Tom, for asking. It's a personal issue for me. I grew up as a Baptist, you know, and Baptists in my story come out as being pretty anti-Catholic, and that's my background. My parents raised me in a Baptist church out in the country in Conway County. There's a rural town distinction too. I found more anti-Catholicism in rural areas, less in towns. So I grew up in an environment that was pretty anti-Catholic. But when I was about 6th grade, my only brother, who's 4 years older than me, converted to Catholicism. And was just so devout, would sneak around, was baptized as a Catholic, go to Mass, but my parents nearly had a cow over that. I consider this the only really traumatic event of my childhood. I had a pretty charmed, conflict-free childhood, and the only really conflicted, prolonged issue of my childhood was hearing these angry debates between my brother and my parents over religion. And many of the things that I've talked about in the book, I heard my mom and my dad say those things in those conversations. So for me, I've just been kind of interested in it and just stumbled onto some materials. Actually, in the doing some reading about something else, I stumbled onto the existence of that Liberator newspaper, and I thought, that's interesting. There was an anti-Catholic newspaper in Arkansas, and I think because I was interested in it, I decided to follow that trail, and it took me to this book. And by the way, I've dedicated my book to my brother, who's still a very devout Roman Catholic, and in fact works in the church in his parish in Mountain Home, Arkansas.